Right, well, thank you everybody for coming. We had no idea how many people were going to be here, so we thought we might very well just be in a room talking to ourselves, and it's fantastic to see that's not the case, because that would have been quite embarrassing. So, just as a quick show again, so we teach for a living. We are going to talk like teachers during this. Show of hands, how many of you know the site Meeple like us and know the work that we actually do? Okay. Right, so we probably don't have to spend too much time going over that then, although I'll give a brief introduction for the people who aren't aware of what it is we actually do. So, I'm Michael Heron. I'm the main contributor to the site, and I'm a lecturer in computing science, and my research interest is accessibility, primarily the accessibility of games.
My name's Pauline Belford. I'm his other half, for better or worse. I get to play all the board games with him and test them. So like we'll be playing games and I'd be like, yeah, there's a real issue with colour blindness here, or I start spotting things now because I've been doing this for a year and a half. It's all my fault that the site started, I think, because I gave him a fairly large voucher for Amazon a couple of Christmases ago, and he's like, oh, I think I want to buy some board games with these, and then about £3,500 and a year and a half later. Yeah, we've played loads. But yeah, I also I'm a computing lecturer. So
yeah, £3,500 of research material.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got to get the terminology right because it's what I've been using on the tax returns. Right, so we're all aware that tabletop games have become incredibly popular over the past 5 or so years. I mean, the explosion has been a literal explosion, not literal. It has been an actual explosion of popularity, to the point that it's something like 20 or 30% growth per year. I mean, it is a ridiculous golden age as far as the popularity of tabletop games go. And even if you just look at the UK Games Expo, the number of people on a year-by-year basis who are coming here and the amount of extra space they need to make available is really quite spectacular. The problem with that is that while it is a golden age of board games, it's not a golden age for everybody, because even nowadays there are games that are fundamentally inaccessible to large groups of the population. And what we're going to talk about in this little presentation here is we're going to talk about some of the standard categories of accessibility that you're probably aware of, and then we're also going to talk about some of the more universal aspects of accessibility that mean that basically all of us benefit from this, regardless of our own personal circumstances. The games that we're actually seeing these days are ridiculously innovative. Before we started playing board games, I mean, before that I was researching in computer games, video games more than anything else. And I kind of thought that I knew everything about games at that point. I mean, I'd sit down to a new game and think, oh yeah, it's that one with that mechanic from that one there. I didn't really think I could be surprised by games anymore. And then we started playing board games and it turns out, oh, that's where all the innovation's hiding. It's in these boxes. You open it up and every single one of them is a treasure trove of new things. And you don't see as much convergence on the standard reliable classics in board games because there's so much room for innovation and the barrier to entry is so low. So there's so much innovation and there is so much excitement in how these games are actually designed. But it actually means that there is this really interesting aspect about board games in that they are a much older form of recreation than video games, but they're actually far more complicated to deal with from an accessibility perspective. The amount of interactions and the number of different kinds of interactions that you get are phenomenal. There's just every single game has its own unique aspects to go with it. And that's going to cause a number of problems. For example, we're going to go through some of the games that are particularly interesting or unusual if they're the first kind of games that you encounter in these kind of areas. Galaxy Trucker. Everybody played Galaxy Trucker before? Yeah. So imagine real-time Carcassonne, except that if you place things in the wrong place, you're going to fail. And the speed of the game is set by everybody else at the table. So you're all reaching to pick up these tiles, using them to build a spaceship, but as soon as you want one tile, somebody else gets it, you pick it, you put it on your spaceship, you realise it's not the tile you actually wanted, everything else is a failure from that point onwards. And you're all but guaranteed in Galaxy Trucker to end up with a ship that doesn't make it to the end of the journey. To the point that the scoring in Galaxy Trucker simply says, if you made any points at all, you're a winner. That's literally all it says. So these kind of games are real time, and because the competition is set, the pace of the competition is set by the people at the table, then if somebody is faster than somebody else, it's going to create this asymmetry in accomplishment. And yeah, I mean, it's because the expectation is that you are going to fail. There's also this expectation that you are going to be okay with failure.
Yeah, Fog of Love's an interesting one. Have any of you played it? Yeah. Have you played it with your significant others or just random friends? Yeah.
Yeah, that's not a yes or no question.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Yeah. It's pretty awkward, I would say. I mean, there are people who said they would not play the game with their significant others. The only person that I ever would play the game with is Michael, but as he said in the review, we've been together about 1100 years, so it's fine. But it's just some of the scenarios that come up are just, yeah, I wouldn't want to go there.
Should we talk about making a sex tape, or should we just leave that? Yeah,
no,
let's not. Yeah.
No.
Nobody wants to envisage that. Yeah, so I mean, the thing is, those kind of conversations that you have are, depending on who you're working with, either quite intimate or quite ridiculous. So if you are having a conversation with your significant other, and one of the cards comes up, and here's the scenario: we want to get pregnant. And you think to yourself, this is a conversation I don't want to have at this particular time, because it's going to then bleed over into real life. And those kind of things happen whenever you open the door to these kind of conversations. And Fog of Love is full of situations like that. It's full of situations about how do you feel about these particular things here, and how are you going to react if these kind of topics get raised.
Have any of you played The Resistance? Yeah. Okay. I like The Resistance. I tend to take it along. I sometimes actually let my students play games with me, and it's great because you get to accuse your students of being liars and deceitful, and they just have to take it. But it's really difficult if you play it with people who just don't have a lot of empathy and aren't good at reading, you know, body language or facial expressions. So I've taken this to games nights that I go to at a friend's house, and her and her son both struggle to read other people, and she was completely convinced that Judy was lying. And she was so proud of this fact that she could tell that Judy was lying, even though she has no idea, she can't read the rest of us, but she could read Judy. The rest of us, it was plain as day that Judy was not lying and was telling the truth. So poor Barbara was still wrong. But, yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing about this as well is that this is a game where you have a confederate at the table, someone who is going to be on your side, until such time as you become a liability to that person. And then suddenly that one person, the only person that you could rely on, turns on you and basically dobs you into the rest of the group. So you've also got this sort of betrayal arc in the game, that as soon as you become a liability, you're the problem. But once you become a liability, it's obvious, and it's a liability that you created. So once you've got these kind of situations in here, it's difficult to think when you're targeted in this, think, maybe it was because I just didn't play very well, or I'm not very good at these kind of games, or maybe I just don't communicate well. Terror in Meeple City, I don't know if anybody's had a chance. It used to be called Rampage, I think. It's one of the more interesting games that we've looked at, because I think it's the first one, or one of the very few games, where actually being able to breathe is important. Because one of the attacks that you have, I mean, basically if you've never played it, you've got these wooden monster meeples, and your job is to destroy a city made up of various different kinds of cardboard tiles. And one of the attacks you have is a breath attack. And what you do is you put your head on top of the thing, and you blow as hard as you can to try and knock things over or knock little meeples into different places. And I think that was the first game we ever saw where breath was important. Being able to blow hard was quite important.
Yeah, and I think that's good, because then it actually values the fact that I am actually physically fit and spend a lot of time at the gym, which obviously you do as well. But,
obviously, yeah. I mean, look at this physique.
Sorry.
I know it must be difficult looking at a Superman like myself, but you know, I do work at it quite hard. Right. So games like Codenames, which are basically trying to give a clue that's good enough to pass muster with the people you're working with, but not so good as the other people can actually work out what you're trying to say. And that stresses vocabulary, but also stresses your ability to be creative within vocabulary. So it's not just a case of being able to know words, but also to be able to know things like synonyms and antonyms, and being able to make metaphors and those different kinds of things. So it's okay to be literate and play code names, but it's much, much better if you are actually fluent in a language so that you can actually make these kind of clever references.
Yeah, well, I was going to say something else about code names. I really struggle with code names because in order to win it, you have to come up with clues that are going to cover, you know, multiple words rather than just one word at a time. And I find that really difficult to do, or else I come up with something and then it also includes the word that's for the assassin.
Yeah.
So.
And Codenames has the Scrabble problem, which is if you have somebody else that says something like effervescent 5 and the other team gets it, and you're sitting there and you say dog 1, you know, you just look like an idiot in comparison. Dixit has similar kinds of issues with that.
Yeah, I love Dixit, but it does have some accessibility issues, and again, it's really difficult to come up with a word that is not, that's not blindingly obvious, but also is going to be something that some people are going to get, but not everyone's going to get. So it does have certain accessibility issues that are to do with do you know the people that you're playing with? So Michael and I have played that with his in-laws, and he gave a clue which I knew definitely what it would be, but his in-laws, they had absolutely no idea what that was going to be. So it kind of depends on in references. So you can exclude people. Yeah,
and there's also, into that you're also thinking about things like general knowledge, trivia, geography, all these different kinds of knowledge bases that people have. But I mean, we'll come back to that issue of the exclusion of people with that when we actually go a bit further on. Unlock, one of a tremendously popular range of escape rooms in a box. The thing about Unlock is you have no idea what you're going to be facing when you open that. You know there's going to be a set of cards. Beyond that, you've got no idea. So graphical clues are hidden to make it as visually inaccessible as possible. And that's intentional, but it's something that makes it really quite difficult if people are trying to scan the game environment to work out what's going to be happening. There's standard sets of puzzles that you're kind of expected to know how to solve. There's brand new puzzles that you're not expected to solve. Well, you're expected to solve, but not expected to know in advance. And you never know in advance what's actually going to be in there. And then games like Yamatai, which are basically just color parsing exercises, looking at this board of all these different kinds of colors and trying to work out what is the thing I can do to bring this pattern of colors into what it's supposed to be. And Yamatai is interesting from the perspective of its colour accessibility in that it has virtually none. It is a really difficult game to play for most categories of colour blindness. And I mean, that's not true wall to wall. I mean, different kinds of colour blindness, which we'll touch on in a second, different kinds of colour blindness are going to be affected in different kinds of ways. But if you were going to be picking a game on the basis of I'm colourblind and I think I might be able to play this, Yamatai is not one that we would recommend at all.
No, I wouldn't recommend playing it in our kitchen either, because the lighting's so bad you can't tell the difference between the brown and the black ones anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we weren't going to invite you to do that, but just, if it does come up. Yeah, so I mean, that's only the start. And video games, despite being more real-time demanding than most board games, are actually a much easier problem domain for accessibility. And that was the area that we worked in most before we started looking at this. Because there's a set interface for a video game. And it might be different from different kinds of consoles and such, but you've got a controller, you have some kind of representation of the game, and you have a player. If you can solve the connection between those things there, you basically have made the game accessible. And we know how to do that. We know how to make video games accessible. The game accessibility guidelines, for example, are tremendously useful for that. But the difficulty is not making games accessible, it's getting people to realise that A, it's possible, B, it makes money in the end, and C, it's not as difficult as people think. So it's no longer a challenge of how do we do this, but rather how do we get people to do it. The thing is with a board game, what is the interface to a board game? What is the user interface that we actually rely on? And it comes down to there isn't actually a user interface. Every game is its own user interface, and many of them stress a uniqueness in there. So there's no convergence towards having a common controller, a common output, a common set of rules. Every single thing in a board game is going to be meaningfully unique. And that means if you think about accessibility as a challenge, every single game is its own unique puzzle. And that's, I think, what makes this such an interesting and difficult problem area. It's one that we don't actually have solutions. I don't know if anybody came looking for solutions, so we're going to be disappointing you here that there aren't any. But it's just one of the things that makes this such an interesting thing. But it's not even so much just the games themselves. It's also the mindset that goes into this. Has anybody here heard of the medical model of disability? Yeah. Way back in the past, by which I mean 20 or 30 years ago, it's far enough in the past as far as any of us is concerned, the idea of disability was defined by what we call the medical model of disability. And that's basically, if you have a disability, you're broken. Our job is to fix you to a minimum level of functioning, and then basically from that point on, life is up to you. So if you're thinking about wheelchairs and the like, if you were in a wheelchair and you were mobile, that was fine. That was enough for the medical model. This problem has been addressed. It's been addressed in a way that doesn't actually solve as many problems as you might think, but it has been addressed. Over the past 20 or so years, we've started moving to a more inclusive model, and that's called the social model of disability. And I really should have looked up there to make sure these slides were being shown before. So the photo here, this is one of the canonical examples that we have of the difference in how these two models work. The medical model would say the disability here is whatever is causing this person not to be able to walk. But actually, that's not where the disability is. If you think of it in terms of a wider sociological context, the disability is not the wheelchair, the disability is not the person in the wheelchair. The wheelchair is an accessibility aid. It's not a problem, it's a solution. The problem there is actually the stairs, because the stairs are the thing stopping someone getting from one place to another. And the thing is, stairs don't occur naturally in real life. You know, they don't just spontaneously generate in front of doors on a second story. That door was there for a reason, and those stairs were put there by somebody. So what the social model is basically saying is we need to be mindful of those kind of things. Do you want to talk about your racist bridges?
Oh, yeah, this goes back to when I was a student and I did this sociology of scientific knowledge or something as like an optional unit at uni. But yeah, so there's this guy, was it Robert Moses? If anyone's heard of him, he was a city architect. Was it in New York? Doesn't matter. Well, it was some American city, and so he had this thing about urban planning, and he was basically trying to keep the people that should be in the ghettos away from the people in the affluent suburbs. So he deliberately got bridges designed that they were so low that buses could not go under them, so that the people who lived in the ghettos and relied on public transportation were not able to go to Jones Beach, this beautiful beach. It was just keeping it separate for these upper middle class, white, nice WASP, families rather than, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the weaponization of the social model of disability. So, I mean, basically the idea is that when things happen, they happen because people did them. And if there is an inaccessibility, it's there because people put that inaccessibility there. And I've had many of these experiences myself, in that one of the things I used to do more often than I currently do is I developed this game, a text-based multiplayer game. And one of the things I focused on there was accessibility. And I remember one of the players saying to me, I can't do this thing in the game. And it's okay, I can't expect to be able to do everything that everybody else can do. And my response to that, first of all, was, why can't you expect that? Because that problem you have is a problem I put there for you. I didn't think about this when I put it in, therefore I am the reason why you cannot play this game. And it's just this mindset thing of, people should be able to expect this basic kind of interaction. So it's not, again, the wheelchair, it's not the disability that's the inaccessibility, it's the stairs, and somebody put those stairs there. Now, within board games, we have this kind of awkward thing, in that inaccessibility is where all the fun comes from. And that's one of the core things in any kind of game design challenge. So I'm going to ask Pauline to explain how sports work, because I've tried to do this in front of people before and just embarrassed myself. Apparently football isn't played in a room with some guys kicking a thing, which is pretty much what my definition of it was.
Oh, yeah, we were talking about golf. Do any of you play golf? No, okay.
Not a big sporting crowd.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I don't play golf either. I run. and lift weights and climb. But anyway, that's not important.
No.
The important thing is that in golf, like, you don't think, oh, I'm going to play a game of golf if you're just going to the practice range. You know, because at the practice range, you don't have the same obstacles. You're basically perfecting your stroke. You're seeing, you know, perfecting either your drive or, you know, your putting abilities or various things like that. But what makes the game of golf fun is you've got to walk, well, apparently fun, is you've got to walk for miles. There's bunkers in the way, there's sections of rough so you can hit your ball into the long grass, so you have to deal with that issue, getting it back out. And there's sometimes like water features where you can like hit your ball in the water and have to start again. And you're also keeping a score, whereas if you just go to the practice range, all you're doing is you're perfecting your stroke. So it doesn't have the same obstacles there, and it's much less fun.
Yeah, you definitely made golf sound fun. I think we're all dying to go out and play that now.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, if you think of what is golf, it's I really shouldn't do this, but I know nobody else plays it, so we're fine. It's safe. It's a game of taking a ball and putting in a hole. That's basically all it is. But if that was all the game was, there's no fun there. So instead, it's taking a ball, putting in a hole by hitting it with a stick. But that by itself is not a huge amount of fun. So you take that ball, you take the stick, you bend it at the end, pretty sure that's how it works, and then you try and hit it with the stubby bit into the hole. Okay, that's a bit more fun. Now you take that hole and you put it hundreds of meters away. That's a bit more fun. And as Pauline said, you throw stuff in the middle of it. It becomes more fun the more that you do with this. But every single thing you're doing there is you're intentionally adding an inaccessibility in there, because it's the overcoming of the inaccessibilities that creates the fun and the challenge. So when we talk about accessibility in board games, what we also have to be mindful of is a fully accessible game is often far too much to expect. What we tend to have to expect is that games will be inaccessible intentionally as much as they need to be, and all the unintentional inaccessibilities, it's a train wreck of a sentence, all the unintentional inaccessibilities will be removed. So basically that's what we kind of do with the site. We're looking for what are actually the ways in which the core of a game could be maintained and the unintentional problems be removed. Because a lot of these things are entirely unintentional. It's not because the game had to be inaccessible in a particular way. It's just either nobody thought about it, or it didn't get caught at the right kind of time, or it was just too difficult to address. Just to talk about what we actually are thinking about here with inaccessibility, here are some of the categories that we tend to look at when we discuss games. So colourblindness is usually the simplest one to solve, at least from a theoretical basis, because the solution to colour blindness is simple: double code everything. Never use colour as the only channel of information. Accompany it with an icon, accompany it with a texture, accompany it with anything else. If you can do that, then your game is colourblind accessible. It's as simple as that. Colour palettes, on the other hand, right, I probably shouldn't improvise while we're going here, but I have yeah, so yeah, you can see that. It's one of my finer pictures.
It's showing your power pack still.
Ah, okay. Which is right. Okay. So,
I think if you're in slideshow, you just have to stay in slideshow unless you exit it.
Well, let's exit it then. We can do whatever we like here. We're in charge.
Right, no, you've got nothing. Well done.
Right. Okay. Well, let's pretend none of that happened. That was a disaster. Right. Yeah. So we look at 4 standard categories of colour blindness, and they're the red, green colourblind, blue, green colourblind, those kind of things. Those are the most common categories of colour blindness, but those aren't the only ways in which colour blindness manifests. People who, for example, have a stroke sometimes have degrees of colour blindness. People who have injuries to their head sometimes have whole colour range reversed, that they'll see green instead of red and red instead of green. We all become a little bit more colourblind as we get older, so we start to see reds as more as pinks as time goes by. So it's not enough to say this game is accessible for these categories of colour blindness, because there's no such thing as a colourblind accessible set of colours. There are colours that are better than others, but generally what we're looking for here is to try and get information to be double coded. Visual impairments, then you've got things like, contrast is often an issue, the size of fonts is often an issue, readability of fonts, the amount of information on the table, how much of that information you need to be aware of, and all these different kinds of things. Fluid intelligence you can think of as your mental processing speed. It's not quite what it is, but it's close enough. So how much do you need to think about? How often do you need to think about it? How deeply do you need to think about things? How many things do you need to think about at once? How many rules do you have to worry about working together? So card games, for example, often have particular kinds of synergies and chains that occur, that you play this card with this card and this particular kind of effect occurs. Those kind of synergies take a lot of time or a lot of cognitive processing to work out how they're going to work, how they're going to interact, and how you're going to make them work in the best possible ways. Memory, well, anybody played here Twilight Struggle, by any chance? Yeah. Twilight Struggle is a game that if you do not know the composition of the deck, you are going to get destroyed by anybody who does. It's not even going to be funny. You get this hand of cards and you think, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And think, oh yeah, that's fantastic. No, I'm doing this, which basically undermines all of that, and look, I've just won the Cold War. If you need to memorize a lot of deck composition in order to play, that's a memory issue. If you need to remember what's come out of a hidden deck, that's an inaccessibility, memory inaccessibility. Games tend to be relatively okay for this because there's state tracking for almost everything in a game these days. I mean, you've even got first player trackers to keep track of who's actually going to be going next. So these kind of things here tend to be, how much are you expecting people to remember about the game in order to be able to actually compete meaningfully with other people? Fine motor control, so basically how much dexterity do you have in your hands versus gross motor control, how much physical movement do you have actually moving around the desk and the like. So as you might expect, dexterity games, not a great fit for that. Terra and Meeple City is a good example because it's not just about how accurately you can flick a particular piece. It's also about, can you move around the table, pool player style, to the point where you can actually get the right kind of angle of attack on a particular thing. So occasionally you might find yourself, sprawled over a table, just trying to get it at the right angle. And if you don't have either the fine-grained motor control or the gross motor control for that, that can become incredibly difficult. And that's a game where you can't necessarily just say to somebody, yeah, hit that thing at that thing, and then that's my turn. Some games work quite well in terms of what we call verbalization. So how well can you describe a game and how much of the fun comes from playing the game as opposed to manipulating the game? And dexterity games are all bound up in this idea of sometimes it's fun just to flick things at other things. Communication impairments, so sound is not hugely well emphasized in board games. Communication often is, but we tend to work on the assumption that if you're playing with a group of people, you have solved communication in some way, shape, or form. You have, for example, a signing agreement, or you've got some way of transferring information between a group of people. But some games stress that at speed. Some games stress it in terms of its complexity. Some require you to convince people to do things while other people are trying to convince other people not to do those things. The Resistance, for example, you will often be talking over other people and trying to make people disbelieve what they're saying. So if you've got communication impairment and you're finding it difficult to articulate what you want to say, and some other complete nasty person is trying to convince everybody else that you should not do that, you're at so much of a disadvantage just because you can't speak as clearly, you can't talk as eloquently, you can't articulate the same kind of way. Because in these kind of games, eloquence is a kind of tool of its own. If you can talk well, you will convince people. So those are what you might think of as sort of standard categories of accessibility. Then we move into the more, slightly more controversial ones. So, how many of you have ever played a game with a bad loser? Why are you putting your hand up?
Oh, no, I'm not talking about you, honest.
Okay, fair enough.
But yeah.
So, board games are incredibly group dependent. So every single board game, if you play Monopoly with the right group of people, it's going to be fantastic. If you play your favourite board game with the wrong group of people, it's going to be terrible. But some games are better than others as far as making it easy to deal with winning and losing. If you look at, for example, again, I know this isn't the game that we're actually going to be thinking about this particular convention, but Monopoly. The loss in Monopoly is really quite bad. It's not just, oh, you've passed the thing and I won. It's, yeah, everything you've just got, that's mine. I've just won all of that. Every single bit of it, that is mine now. And this stuff that I've got here, this is now what I can use to win the rest of this game. It's a really unpleasant kind of way to actually lose a game, to just have somebody take all your progress and use it to win something else. So some games are really, really bad for how much they let people gloat and how painful they make the actual losing. So we've got this category of emotional accessibility. If you were going to be playing a game with a bad loser, is this a game you'd want to play with them? But it also includes emotional control disorders and all these different kinds of things, in that how much are you trying to frustrate what other people are trying to do? How much are you going to make it so that you're responsible for them having no fun? And again, this is hugely group dependent. My trigger game is Catan. I cannot play Catan because I get angry. I get so angry that I've spent my entire turn doing nothing. And then somebody says, oh, here's my night card. I'm going to take this one thing that you got. And then somebody puts the robber in my space and takes the other thing, and I'm left with nothing. It's rage-inducing. Yeah, it was just terrible. It's just awful. Nobody should play Catan. It's awful.
Yeah, and they also shouldn't play Lords of Waterdeep against him. Yeah, no, like, I don't like games that are too much PvP. I like things where, you know, I get something, but another player gets something as well. So Lords of Waterdeep, I rarely play the intrigue cards, whereas Michael will pick up all the intrigue cards and keep giving me mandatory quests and just completely destroying my enjoyment of the game.
How much did you enjoy our last game of Azul?
Oh, that was, don't mention that.
Yeah. So what we also look at are economic issues, so business models. This is a luxury hobby. We know that's the case, that it's not just something that people can just say, well, I'm going to buy this high-end new game. I'm going to buy Rising Sun. It's like, 80 quid out on the trading floor. That's not an easy chunk of money for a lot of people to put down. But we know that going in. But there are some games where the business models are really very inaccessible. Collectible card games, for example. If you're a collectible card gamer, that's absolutely fine. But you know going in that you are not going to get everything you want. And in order to get what you want, you're going to have to spend huge amounts of money. So economic models and things are quite kind of important there. And if you are on a budget, what's also important is kind of unusual factors, like how many people does this game actually play? If I've got a family, is this a game that I'm going to be able to play with my family if I can only buy one game in a particular period of time? And how long are we going to actually be able to play this? Like, if this is a 15-minute game, I could fit that in a busy part of my day. If it's a 3-hour game, even if it works for the right group of people I have, when are we going to get the time to sit down and do that? So these are kind of economic factors of accessibility. Do you want to talk about the sociological one, or do you see as a sociology background? Or do you want me to take that bullet?
You can take the bullet.
So, undoubtedly the most controversial of the categories we look at in Meeple Like Us is the sociological aspect. And this is partially because people don't necessarily agree this is an accessibility issue, but basically our view is anything that stops somebody from engaging in the hobby is an inaccessibility. And we consider things like representation, diversity, inclusion, all these different things, sociological accessibility issues. And that if you look at a shelf of board games and it's all white men and sheep, what that's basically saying to you is this is a hobby for white men who like sheep. It's not that people won't overcome that. If somebody wants to play a game, that's not going to stop them playing it. But if you wander into a place and think, I can see who they're aiming at and it's not me, that's a barrier that gets in people's way. And if there's enough of them, then that creates an overwhelming impression. It's not that any one game is a problem in this. It's just when you take all these games in the aggregate and you look at them, you think to yourself, actually, yeah, it's obvious that I'm not actually being catered for here. And there's no reason for it. I mean, play is not a gendered activity. I mean, we can see it just from the room here. It's not a gendered activity. And when you look at Toys R Us or such, they have boys' toys and girls' toys. It used to be the case they just had toys. And if you look at sort of the evolution of Lego in particular, Lego began as a gender-neutral toy. And then it gradually became, well, boys like building things more than girls, so let's aim it all at, fathers and sons. And if you have a look at the advertising campaigns from the 80s and the 90s, they're very much that. It's just boys with their toys. To the point that it's been such a difficulty for Lego that they tried to solve it first with the Lego Friends range, which is sort of Lego for girls. Surprisingly, wasn't hugely successful. And now they've just tried to basically roll back for this whole idea of gendered Lego in general. So yeah, if people don't see themselves reflected in the culture of the entertainment products, they're less likely to actually want to engage in those kind of things. Disability is obviously the most significant use case of accessibility. The thing is, it's not the only use case. Every single one of us benefits from accessibility on a day-to-day basis. Anybody here ever heard of the curb cut effect? One of the most important observations that people have made about accessibility is that if you fix something for one group of people, you fix it for others. And if you think about when you're on a street, and you're coming to an intersection and you see how the pavement actually dips down to the road. That's a curb cut. And it was designed in Berkeley in the 60s as a way to let people with wheelchairs move around the city. But what it actually turned out was, it's not just people in wheelchairs that benefit from that. People with mothers with strollers, fathers with strollers, they get that huge benefit from it. People who are pushing trolleys around get benefit. Older people who don't want to make a big jump down to the, not jump down, but a big step down to the street. That's useful for them. Bicyclists, it's all very useful for huge groups of people. And there's this idea of the curb cut that you make a fix for one thing and you make that fix for lots and lots of other people. And accessibility is a very significant way in which we do that. You make things better for one group of people and you make it better for everybody. My old PhD supervisor had this fantastic line which basically changed the way I looked at this whole topic, which is ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, so basically any of us in unusual times in our lives, have the same kind of issues as extraordinary people in ordinary circumstances. So if you have, let's say you've got some degenerative nerve disorder in your fingers and you don't actually have the ability to finely position something, that's kind of the same thing. Not exactly, but kind of the same thing in terms of the problems you'll face interacting with something if you're on a rickety bus. It's basically the same thing. So if you're trying to type a text message on your phone and you don't have fine motor control, and you try and type a text message on a rickety bus where it's just juddering around and you can't actually do anything, the solution to that is exactly the same problem, exactly the same thing. Either make it easier to type, add some kind of prediction into the typing, all these different kinds of things. You fix it for one and you fix it for everybody else. Every one of us in this room is getting older. Sorry, spoilers there, but we are, generally on a one-for-one basis. So as we get older, we tend to get a suite of accessibility issues that come along with age. And they happen very slowly, they happen very subtly, and often we're not aware that we're actually in need of accessibility support. Show of hands, how many of you are older than 25? Yeah. How many of you knew that cognitive decline begins at 25? Yeah, depressing, isn't it? Roughly at the rate of 0.8% per year, our brains get worse, and it gets faster as we get older. Now, it's not quite that simple. Our brains also get better in certain respects. We get slower in the processing, but get much, much better in terms of wisdom and being able to draw from experiences and such. So it kind of evens out. But our eyesight tends to decay as we get older, our sensitivity, our strength, our constitution, all these different kinds of things go away. So as we get older, we're going to need these kind of accessibility supports, because if we don't get them, we're just not going to be able to play the games. And I'm sure, most of us are planning, I assume, when we retire, to actually still be playing these games, maybe for the first time, because when do you get the time otherwise? So accessibility is how we basically guarantee that when that happens, we might actually be able to get some of those unplayed games off of the shelf for once. One of the lenses we use for this, when we look at accessibility in general, is what's often called universal design. And that's a case of look at different kinds of accessibility categories in terms of three main kinds of manifestations. Permanent, which are the ones that we generally tend to think of as disabilities. Temporary, which are the things that happen to us on an occasional basis, and they'll happen for a while, but then they'll stop happening. And then intermittent, which are things that might be happening, and then on and off kind of things that occur in particular kind of circumstances. Permanent, monochromancy. So it's 1 in a million people who can't actually see colour, see just sort of shades of grey. Temporary, on the other hand, bad lighting. We all encounter bad lighting at certain points of time. The game Memoir 44, for example, we can't actually put it away in the box because we can't tell the difference between the greens and the blues because of the lighting in the kitchen that we have.
Yeah, actually, to be fair, it's because we've only played it in the winter. In the summer, if we actually get sunlight, bright sunshine in Scotland in the summer, it occasionally happens, then it is possible, but it's really, really difficult.
Yeah, any of these that refer to sunlight, well, obviously we're doing by reputation more than anything else. So, intermittent kind of issues. Inference of colour. So,
Context.
Yeah, inference of context. How many of you remember the dress that was white and gold? Yeah, it was white and gold. It was
not white and gold. It was blue and something.
We'll be here all day if we do this. Yeah, so that's an inference of colour. So, depending on the context of the colour, it's not just light information that tells us what colour it is, it's also what it's surrounded by. And we're not in a particularly well-lit room at the moment, but in the packs that you have, there's like a few examples of inference of colours problems. That you can see that all of the colours in there are sort of similar or identical, but you would never know it because of the context that's there. For visual, you've got things like total blindness, which is the relatively rare circumstance that you can't see anything. Visual impairment is far more common. But temporary impairments, well, what about if you've got an eye patch and then you lose pretty much all your depth perception? What if you've got sunlight in your eyes? And again, basically largely by reputation. Apparently it's not very good, but we'll just have to take your words for that. So these are kind of intermittent issues that depends on what's actually happening on a step-by-step basis. Cognitive problems, well, dementia, that's one obvious one. Being drunk, that's a temporary one, you'd kind of hope.
Yeah, I've tried to play Pandemic with my parents and teach them how to play it after they'd had a couple of bottles of wine. It didn't go well. We're all dead now.
To be fair, you'd probably want to be drunk when you're dealing with that kind of situation in real life. You wouldn't want to face a pandemic sober. Or being distracted. Just somebody talking to you while you're trying to do something puts a tremendous amount of cognitive load on people. Physical problems. Paralysis is one. A broken arm, well, there's something that's going to cause a very significant impact on your physical dexterity. Or if you're just holding something heavy. Or, like, for example, if you're holding a child and the child is squirming around, it's difficult for you to actually do anything that requires any dexterity. And sure, you could put the kid down, but while that's happening, you have accessibility issues. Emotional issues, well, you have actual genuine emotional control disorders. But work stresses as well. So, I mean, if things aren't going well at work, you're going to be in a kind of a bad mood. I mean, possibly. I mean, our jobs are fantastic, so obviously that never happens. But, yeah, they force us to say, we've got microchips in the back of our heads that are basically tracking what we say here. So if you've got these work stresses, you're going to be less likely to be... sorry, you better check the time. Oh, God, have I spoken for that length of time already? Yeah, so work stresses are going to make it so that you're going to snap at people and you're going to be more likely to react to the kind of emotional issues that we spoke about. Or just if you're in a bad mood, just in a bad mood with one particular person. Communication issues, well, deaf is one of the permanent ones. Lost voice, well, that can have a big impact on what you're likely to do. Or if you're in a mixed language environment, so that you're having difficulties talking to one person but no difficulties talking to the other person there. And then for socioeconomic things, ethnicity, cash flow problems, and occasionally if you're just an unpleasant company, somebody who's decided to just make a game unpleasant while you're playing it. So that kind of intermittent thing that it's only while they're involved in the game it's a problem. Yeah, we are going to have to just skip through basically all of this.
Yeah.
Right. So as I say, if you came here looking for solutions, we don't have any. Basically, we just have a big laundry list of problems that we don't know how to solve. And one of the key things that we sort of need to do here is talk about the fact that the work that we do for the site is incredibly limited, and nobody is more aware of that than we are. Because this work is we are primarily abled. We have issues. I have diabetes, and occasionally, there's some nerve issues that come with that, some vision issues that come with it as well. But generally speaking, we do these things at sort of an enabled perspective. So when we actually do the kind of work that we do, which is look at each of these games and assign ratings in all these different kinds of categories, it might all very well be nonsense because we don't have that embodied perspective. We do have years of expertise with accessibility research, but that's not the same thing as having years of experience with disability. So we do the best that we can because really nobody else is doing this kind of work. But it is very likely that the number of things that we say in this they just don't make any sense for particular kinds of circumstances. And when we assign these kind of letter grades that we do, can't show it because I don't know how to work the technology. No. We have a master list. If you go to the site and click on the master list, you'll see all the different kinds of grades that we've given for things. And those flatten all nuance. There's nothing behind those grades that actually realistically maps onto a condition. All we can really say is that we think if this is something you're concerned about, there are reasons to be concerned, or we think it's probably going to be okay. So basically what they do is they map out points of interest. But mostly what we do for this is we have basically a document that we call the Teardown. And the Teardown is literally just a series of heuristic lenses. If you have a look in your information packs, one of the things that we actually have in there is an academic paper that we just recently published on the topic of Meeple-centered design, which is what the framework of this project is. And it goes through each of the individual lenses that we use. It is unfortunately an academic paper, so it's the opposite of readable, because that's how academia works. There is a more readable version on our website, but when I printed it out, it basically looked like I'd taken a page of MySpace and just everything was everywhere, and it was just so noisy and busy. So this was the only thing we can get that looked like it actually should be printed out. So if you have a look at those things there, you'll see how we actually conduct these kind of teardowns and the kind of different things we look at. But basically, in terms of this particular topic here, what we're aiming for is a kind of empathic design more than anything else. How many of you are actually designers of games, or publishers of games? Yeah. So what we're really looking for here is an appreciation of the fact that every kind of decision that's made in a game is going to have some kind of accessibility impact. And some of those are going to be necessary. Some of those you just think to yourself, well, this is a game, it's going to be strategy driven, it's going to be tactics driven. We can't have a cognitively accessible game in that category. And that's okay. I mean, it's not ideal, but these are the realities of life, that nothing can be entirely accessible to everybody. But if that's where you're going to find your inaccessibilities, what it means is if there are inaccessibilities in other categories, they don't necessarily need to be there. And knowing what those accessibility problems are likely to be means that you can consider, well, does this have to be a case? Can we have full bleed art and give a bit more room for the text? Can we increase the contrast in these kind of things here? And the papers are actually provided as part of the information packs there, hopefully provide enough information for that to actually be useful. I don't know if you want to add anything else, because I've basically monopolised this entire conversation. He said.
Ouch. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously, like, some things are really easy to solve and really inexpensive to solve, or won't necessarily cost anything or add anything to the cost of designing your games. Whereas, like, there have been some suggestions that I remember making suggestions last year that were things that would actually be quite expensive and would add to the cost of prototyping and things. So.
Oh yeah, I mean that's one of the hugely interesting things about board games as well. There are logistical aspects here. You know, if you make a video game more accessible, it doesn't change the per unit cost. But if you increase just the mass of a figure a tiny little bit, that increases the cost of a box, which increases the cost of a pallet, which increases the cost of the shipping, and it has these massive impact things as time goes by. Yeah. So.
But I was going to say about reading your academia stuff.
Uh-huh.
Easiest thing is to do coloured paper.
Yes.
It makes a massive difference.
That's, yeah.
Obviously also tailoring your different types of fonts. We work mostly in memory games.
Yeah.
So we work the game and we sit there and go, right, which fonts
to
see from distance.
Yeah, we've got two dyslexic people that can work on very text-based things. So that's the main accessibility thing we have spent a lot of time.
Yeah. I mean, any kind of sort of, it would be tremendous if we had this, and maybe this is something we should actually think about doing, just having a resource for all the lessons learned that people actually have. Because a lot of these things are just, they're not difficult to do, they're just difficult to realise that they should be done. And, you know, it's not difficult, for example, to put coloured paper as a thing they actually use for components and printouts and the like, which we didn't do because, basically we're massive hypocrites. So, I mean, a sort of a well of these kind of tips would be really useful, and it might be worthwhile if people have these kind of tips and such, if you want to email them to me and I can see about collating these into an actual document that might actually be useful for people, because I'm fairly sure everybody here will have solved accessibility issues in one way, shape or form, but just it's sometimes difficult to get that information to other people. And the more of these that we actually have, the better it would be. On the website as well, there is a link called the Tabletop Accessibility Guidelines, and these are basically what we're actually trying to do with that as well. If you are interested in this as a topic and would like to feed in on it, if you can sign up to that page there, and I will approve your accounts and things, and you can actually feed in on how this is actually going on. We have sort of hundreds of guidelines at the moment, but really what we're looking at is sort of editing them down into feasibility more than anything else. That's a project that's basically stalled completely because the past semester has been incredibly busy, but hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll be able to get that up and running once again. So does anybody else have any questions? Although I haven't really left you much time for any.
We should go and be someone else.
Yeah.
I'd just say having a wider pool of play testers.
Yes,
as well.
that's such an important point, because really the biggest solution to this problem here is involve people with disabilities in the testing. If you can involve people with disabilities in testing, they will find your problems for you and they will give you the solutions. So the wider a pool that you can actually have of people, the far better it's actually going to be, even if you've actually got to go out of your way to actually do this. And I know that logistically that's difficult, but if you do have access to people, even if they're not gamers, just sit them down and try and say, even if we're not interested in whether they enjoy the game, if they can play the game, that's a hugely valuable thing to find out. So yeah, fantastic point there, yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned that video games are very good at accessibility, but it seems like they are generally quite good at it from a mechanical.
Well, I'll say that they can be made accessible, but generally speaking, they're not. It's kind of a solved problem in actually making them accessible. It's just people, generally speaking, don't do that. Sorry, yeah, I didn't want to, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm right. But so it seems that with video games that they've sort of, in many ways, tried to deal with the more mechanical things, dealing with a colour blindness, updating font sizes. But do you think that they are still missing it on the, mentioned the sociological things, the less immediately visible?
Yeah. I mean, there's massive ways to go for that, and even just talking about accessibility as a sociological issue is kind of controversial because it's not generally accepted as one of the metrics of accessibility. But I think, like everything, progress is slow, but progress is being made. And the more that you see, like, sort of the canonical example of Lara Croft as a character that was ridiculously objectified and sexualized early on, but when Rhiannon Pratchett took over writing the character, and when is it Naughty Dog who do? No, it's Square Enix. Doesn't matter. When they took over doing the character and tried to apply a more realistic and rounded portrayal of the character, while it wasn't entirely successful, it was an attempt to reclaim a character that was basically a stereotype to begin with, and has now become a more interesting, even if a problematic character. So it's like everything, progress is slow, but it is hopefully being made in the right direction. Right, any other quick questions? Because I think we have to be out of here like a few minutes ago. Right, that's great. Thank you all so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed that.